Evolution. Becoming something almost unrecognizable from what it once was in response to the pressures and forces acting upon it. We usually use that word to talk about nature, but there's another place where evolution is just as real, just as dramatic, and honestly, just as ruthless about leaving certain things behind. You guys already know, I'm talking about basketball. Look at the NBA today. Wembanyama standing at 7 foot 4 inches, handling the ball like a guard, stepping back from 30 feet out, and erasing shots on the other end that have no business being blocked. Or how about Nikola Jokic, a center that led the league in assists, teams launching 50, sometimes 60 three-pointers a game like it's the most normal thing in the world. Rosters built around switching and spacing and a kind of fluid positionless chaos that would have been completely unrecognizable to anyone watching the sport 60 years ago. But here's the thing about evolution. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments, in pressure points, in the specific instant when someone arrives who is so different, so ahead of their time, so fundamentally impossible to deal with using the tools that currently exist, that the entire ecosystem around them is forced to change. And sometimes that change is tactical, sometimes it's cultural, and sometimes it means the league itself has to sit down and rewrite its own rule book just to keep the game from being broken entirely. And just like nature, evolution in basketball has its own extinctions too. Entire archetypes that once defined the sport, player types that championships were built around, simply no longer exist. This is the complete evolution of NBA basketball. Before we get into the full story of how basketball became what it is today, we have to go back, all the way back, because the NBA you just saw in that intro, that league almost didn't survive its first decade. There was a moment where the sport came so close to destroying itself that a single game nearly ended professional basketball forever. The year was 1946. A group of men who owned hockey arenas in the Northeast had a problem. Their buildings sat empty too many nights a week, and empty buildings do not make money. So they invented a solution. The Basketball Association of America was born. And no, it wasn't out of passion for the sport. It wasn't some grand vision for the future of athletics, but it was simply out of a real estate problem. And yet the sport itself is older than all of those guys. Just 55 years earlier, a Canadian physical education instructor named James Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets to a gymnasium balcony in Springfield, Massachusetts, wrote 13 rules on a piece of paper, and invented basketball on a winter afternoon in 1891 because the students needed something to do indoors. From peach baskets in a gym to a professional league built inside hockey arenas. That's how fast this sport moved. The first president of that league was a lawyer who had never watched a basketball game before taking the job. Basketball was simply a side hustle for him. And now, picture what the game actually looked like. Players shot with both feet planted on the floor. A two-handed set shot that looked more like a chest pass aimed at the ceiling than anything you would recognize today. The jump shot existed, sure, but it was considered radical, almost improper. And also there was no shot clock, which meant teams could hold the ball for as long as they wanted. And they did. When a team built a lead, they would literally stand still with the ball tucked under their arm, daring the other team to foul them. Scores were barely crawling into the 40s, so fans walked out and the franchises went broke. And then came the game that almost ended everything. The Fort Wayne Pistons traveled to Minneapolis to play the defending champion Lakers, and the Pistons head coach had spent years trying to figure out how to beat them. He had finally arrived at an answer: don't play basketball. Yeah, you heard that right. From the opening tip, the Pistons stood at midcourt and didn't move. Players held the ball for minutes at a time without taking a shot. The referee screamed from the sideline. The players ignored them. The Pistons won the game 19-18. Fort Wayne attempted 13 total shots in 48 minutes of professional basketball. The local newspaper called it a great black eye for the sport. The league was hemorrhaging fans, hemorrhaging franchises, and a growing number of people believed that the sport simply wouldn't survive. But hold on now, there was a reason Fort Wayne refused to play basketball that night, and that reason was none other than George Mikan. It's sort of sad that most of you guys watching this video have never heard of him, but Mikan was the NBA's first superstar. And calling him dominant feels like an understatement. He stood at 6'10", 245 pounds, wearing thick round glasses. He had actually been cut from his high school freshman team because coaches thought big men were too awkward to be useful. He became so good that when the Lakers played at Madison Square Garden, the marquee outside did not say Lakers versus Knicks. It just said George Mikan versus Knicks. He wasn't a player on a team. He was the reason that you bought a ticket. And he was so dominant that the NBA had to change its own rules to try to slow him down. The painted area near the basket was only 6 feet wide when Mikan arrived. He would simply park himself 2 feet from the basket and the game was over. So in response, the league had doubled the size of the lane, pushing him further from the rim. His numbers dipped, but he adjusted, and the Lakers kept winning anyway. Now here's where the story gets interesting. The stalling problem had not gone away, so something had to change, and the solution came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a bowling alley in Syracuse, New York.
There's only one change you got to make. You got to put a time in a game.
Danny Biasone was an Italian immigrant who owned a bowling alley and happened to also own an NBA franchise. He'd been watching the stalling problem eat the sport alive. And one night, he sat down with his general manager and started scribbling on a napkin. He looked at games he enjoyed, counted the shots, divided by the seconds in a game, and landed on 24. 24 seconds per possession. He ran a scrimmage with a rule, and the effect was immediate. The game moved. It breathed. And for the first time in a long time, it was fun. When the 24-second shot clock was adopted, the transformation happened overnight. Scoring jumped by nearly 14 points per game in a single season. Attendance surged. A bowling alley owner from Syracuse had saved professional basketball with a piece of napkin math. But here's the thing about rule changes in basketball. The league fixes one problem and then a new problem walks through the door wearing a size 22 shoe.
And as the elevator's going down, some guy gets on and says, "How's the weather up there?" He said that to Wilt. Wilt spat on the dude and said, "It's raining."
His name was Wilt Chamberlain, and he made George Mikan look ordinary. He was 7'1", nearly 300 pounds of pure muscle. He ran like a wide receiver and jumped like nobody his size had any right to. This is by far one of my favorite quotes that one of his opponents had said. Wilt Chamberlain lifted me up and moved me like a coffee cup. And as we all know, the numbers Wilt put up are not just historic. They're from another dimension entirely. He claimed to have bench pressed 500 pounds and slept with over 2,000 women. And on the court, in one season, he averaged over 50 points per game. 50! Over a full season. The only time any player in history has ever done that. He scored 100 points in a single game in a small arena in Pennsylvania in front of barely 4,000 people with no television cameras and no highlight reel to be found.
The most amazing scoring performance of all time. 100 points for the Big Dipper.
After the game, as we all know, somebody wrote 100 on a piece of paper and had Wilt hold it up for a photograph. That image is essentially the only proof that it happened. But after watching Bam Adebayo score 83 points recently, I can't help but think that this actually happened. And just like with Mikan, the league had to respond. Wilt Chamberlain forced 4 separate rule changes during his career. The paint area was widened again to where it sits today. Offensive goaltending was formalized as a violation because Wilt would tip shots into the basket from above the rim. Inbounding over the backboard was banned because his teammates had figured out they could just lob it over and Wilt would catch it on the other side before any defender could react. And the free throw dunk. Yeah, that's right, a free throw dunk. Wilt invented a move where he would run from behind the free throw line, leap without crossing it, and slam the ball through the rim. This was outlawed entirely. He once told Michael Jordan at a dinner, "When you played, they changed the rules to make it easier for you to dominate. When I played, they changed the rules to make it harder." Jordan didn't have a response to that. But here's what makes this era so fascinating. Because at the exact same time the most statistically dominant player in basketball history was breaking every record in existence, he was losing, repeatedly, to a man who was smaller, less athletic on paper, and completely uninterested in individual statistics. I gotta show you guys something. I grabbed these cards off of Topps Now, and I wanna show you why you should start your collection too. If you've been sleeping on Topps Now, let me put you on, because these cards are a physical piece of the NBA season that's happening right now. Obviously, I had to get a Luka Doncic one, but this card is when he recorded the fastest 30-point triple-double in NBA history. And my personal favorite, the Jalen Brunson card. This moment is from January 30th when the Knicks star passed 10,000 career points and got the win against the Portland Trail Blazers. I remember watching these games live and now I'm holding them in my hand. That's a real moment frozen forever. And that's what Topps Now does differently. Every card is tied to a specific moment from this season, a big game, a record, or a milestone. And you only have 48 hours to grab them. Once that window closes, they're gone forever. You can't get them anymore. And that's what makes them so special. And if you've never collected before, this is like the best place to start. You don't even need to know anything about collecting, as long as you care about the moment that happens. If you guys want to start your collection with me, then be sure to use my creator link that's in the pinned comment down below, as well as the description. The 48-hour clock is ticking. Don't waste any time. Go check out what's dropping right now at Topps.com. Major thanks to Topps for sponsoring today's video. Bill Russell won 11 championships in 13 seasons, 8 of them consecutively. He retired as a player coach and went out with a championship. What Bill Russell changed was not what you scored. It was what defense meant. Before Russell, shot blocking was almost an accident. You stayed flat-footed. You reacted. And if you happened to get a hand on the shot, great. Russell made defense into a system. He jumped, He timed releases, and critically, he did not swat shots into the stands. He blocked them directly to his own teammates, turning a defensive stop into an instant fast break. Every modern NBA defense, every scheme built around a rim protector who anchors the paint and forces opponents to alter their shots, traces its DNA directly back to Bill Russell. When you put Russell and Chamberlain in the same conversation, you get the foundational argument of basketball. Wilt won the stat sheet almost every single time they met, and yet Russell's team won the vast majority of their playoff series. Wilt was better, but Russell won. Together, these two men defined the first great archetype of NBA basketball, the dominant big. The player whose entire value proposition was his size and his ability to impose his will in the paint. Everything ran through the center position. You built your team around a dominant big, or you were not winning a championship. There were no exceptions. That archetype is almost entirely extinct today. The modern NBA does not want a 7-footer who camps in the paint and scores from 2 feet away. It wants 7-footers who shoot threes and pass out of a pick and roll. The player who anchored everything from a permanent residence in the painted area, who never had to operate more than 8 feet from the basket. In this era, that archetype was the only player that mattered, and the entire sport had to reorganize itself around them. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. That player was heading towards extinction until one individual showed up decades later, reminded everyone exactly what it looked like when a man was simply too big and too strong for the sport to handle. But we're not there yet. The dominant big defined the first era of NBA basketball, but by the mid-1970s, the league that Wilt and Russell had built was in serious trouble. The NBA was bleeding, attendance was down, television ratings were collapsing. The league's substance problem was so severe and so publicly known that CBS was reportedly tape delaying the NBA Finals because executives didn't believe enough that people would stay up to watch it live. That's right, championship games, the biggest moment in the sport, were being aired after the late local news, the pinnacle of the season, and the network didn't trust the audience to care enough to tune in at tip-off. That's insane. And part of the problem was the ABA. The American Basketball Association had been a rival league since 1967, playing with a red, white, and blue ball, offering flashier basketball, and signing players that the NBA didn't want. When the two leagues finally merged in 1976, the NBA absorbed 4 ABA franchises, including the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, the New Jersey Nets, and the San Antonio Spurs. But it also inherited something far more valuable than franchises. It inherited a style of play, a player who embodied everything that style represented, and a rule that nobody quite knew what to do with yet.
Remember, it's only in the ABA that you get an extra point for sinking that long shot, making for some exciting dead-eye shooting in clutch situations.
The ABA had been using a 3-point line since its very first season. Step behind it, make the shot, and instead of 2 points, it counts for 3. The NBA adopted it in 1979 and then proceeded to almost completely ignore it. Teams averaged 1 to 3 attempts from deep per game through most of the 1980s. It was treated like a gimmick, a desperation heave at the end of a quarter rather than a tactical weapon. The line was sitting there right there the entire time. Nobody thought to build around it. And that obviously changes later in the story in a way that nobody saw coming. But for now, file it away. Moving on to that specific player the NBA inherited, you might have heard of him. Julius Erving, also known as Dr. J. If Wilt and Russell were about dominance and will, Dr. J was about something the sport had never seen before. He was about beauty. He was 6'6" with hands so large that he could palm a basketball like a softball. And he played above the rim in a way that made everything else look primitive. He didn't just dunk. He created. He invented. He was unlike anyone that came before him. Dr. J had been doing this in the ABA for years before the merger, winning championships and MVP awards in a league the NBA establishment had largely dismissed. When he arrived in the NBA with the Philadelphia 76ers in 1976, he brought an entire aesthetic with him. The idea that basketball could be art, that what happened between the time a player left the floor and the time he landed could be as important as whether the ball went in.
It's 89-84, Sixers, and they get inside, and unbelievable, Julius Erving. Watch this fantastic move by the doctor.
He was the reason the NBA created the slam dunk contest to begin with. He was the reason a generation of kids started playing basketball the way they wanted to play rather than the way they were taught. But here's the thing about Dr. J. As revolutionary as he was, the culture around the NBA in the late 1970s was complicated. The product on the court had genuine stars, but the business of basketball was fragile. The television relationship was broken, and the sport needed something more than just highlights to survive. What it needed was a rivalry, and in 1979, one arrived that would change everything. On March 26, 1979, Michigan State played Indiana State in the NCAA championship game. Michigan State had a 6'9" point guard named Irvin Johnson, who everybody called Magic. Indiana State had a 6'9" forward from French Lick, Indiana named Larry Bird. It was the most watched college basketball game in television history at that point, and both of them were coming to the NBA the following season. The league would never be the same. Magic Johnson entering the NBA as a point guard who stood 6'9" wasn't just unusual. It was a complete redefinition of what a position even meant. Point guards were supposed to be small, quick, unassuming facilitators. They ran the offense, got the ball to the scorers, and stayed out of the way. Magic Johnson was none of those things. He was enormous, charismatic, and fundamentally incapable of staying out of anything. He saw the floor like a quarterback. His no-look passes weren't tricks or showmanship. They were tactical weapons that arrived at angles defenders couldn't anticipate because defenders are watching him, not the pass. He averaged over 11 assists per game for his career. He also averaged nearly 20 points and just under 8 rebounds. Numbers that would be exceptional for a player at any position. He is the only player in NBA history to win Finals MVP at 5 different positions, including center, which he played in the 1980 Finals as a rookie after Kareem went down with an injury. He was 20 years old, starting at center in a Finals elimination game, and he scored 42 points with 15 rebounds and 7 assists. The Lakers won the championship. Magic was named Finals MVP, and he'd only been in the league for 1 season. The Showtime Lakers became the defining team of the decade. Pat Riley in his suits on the sideline, James Worthy slashing to the rim, Kareem with a skyhook that nobody had ever truly replicated, and Magic Johnson was orchestrating all of it. 5 championships in the 1980s, and throughout that whole time, the ratings climbed. Larry Bird was Magic Johnson's opposite in almost every way and his equal in almost every way. And that tension is what made their rivalry the greatest the sport had ever produced. Where Magic was flashy, Bird was clinical. Where Magic played with visible joy, Bird played with a kind of cold competitive fury that his opponents found genuinely unsettling. He trash talked constantly and specifically told his defenders exactly what he was going to do before he did it and then did it anyway. He wasn't particularly fast. He couldn't jump particularly high. He didn't look like an NBA player. And yet he was one of 2 or 3 best players who ever lived at that point. What Bird had was vision and will and a shooting touch so pure it bordered on unfair. He could read a defense 2 passes before the ball got there. He elevated every single teammate around him because defenses had to account for him at all times, which meant someone was always open. He won 3 consecutive MVP awards. He and Magic met in the finals 3 times. The Celtics won once, the Lakers twice, and every series felt like the entire sport was holding its breath. Together, Magic and Bird did something that transcended basketball. By the time the mid-1980s arrived, NBA games were being broadcast live in prime time for the first time in years. The CBS deal that the league had been struggling to leverage was suddenly valuable. Arenas that had been half empty were selling out. A generation of fans who had drifted away came back, and a new generation discovered the sport for the first time. Because 2 players with a rivalry that felt so natural made the NBA must-see TV. Now, don't get too comfortable, because with all this glamour and showtime that was happening on one coast, something much uglier and grittier was being built in Detroit. The Bad Boy Pistons were the anti-Lakers, and they were just as good. Where Los Angeles was pace and beauty and highlight reels, Detroit was a physical and suffocating defensive team that the league hadn't seen since the Russell era. But don't mistake them for a team that simply tried to bully its way to championships. They were legitimately great basketball players who happened to also be the toughest team in the league. Isaiah Thomas was one of the most gifted point guards who have ever lived. A 6'1" magician who could take over a game in a dozen different ways and who played with a smile on his face that somehow made him more terrifying, not less. Joe Dumars was one of the premier two-way guards of his generation. Dennis Rodman was already becoming the most ferocious rebounder the sport had seen in decades. And Bill Laimbeer, as hated as he was around the rest of the league, was the perfect anchor for everything they were trying to build. What made the Pistons truly special was that they understood something most teams didn't. Winning a championship required a complete identity, not just a collection of talent. Detroit's identity was collective suffocation. They made every single game feel like a fight, and it just so happened that they were better at fighting than anyone else. And how about the Jordan rules? Their specific scheme designed to neutralize Michael Jordan. It wasn't about just hitting him hard. They were a sophisticated defensive system that took away his angles, forced him left, and made sure that every drive in the paint came with a physical consequence. Jordan averaged over 30 points per game against them, and the Pistons beat him 3 years in a row anyway. Because stopping one man, even the greatest player alive, was never the point. Stopping the entire team was. And nobody in that era was better at that than Detroit. They won back-to-back championships in 1989 and 1990, and they earned every bit of it. The reason why they're important to mention is because they embodied something in this era that's easy to overlook when you focus on Magic and Bird and Dr. J. The 1980s NBA wasn't soft. Hand checking was legal, meaning defenders could put a forearm into a ball handler and steer him wherever they wanted. Hard fouls were a part of the game's vocabulary. The Celtics under Kevin McHale could clear the lane with their elbows and nobody blinked. The league celebrated toughness as openly as it celebrated artistry. That combination, the artistry of Magic and Dr. J coexisting with the brutality of the Pistons and the Celtics, is what gave the 1980s NBA its identity. It was a league of enormous personalities and enormous physicality, where the rules still allowed defenders to be genuinely aggressive with each other, where championships were built on both ends of the floor, and where the difference between a good team and a great one was often nothing more than who was willing to be tougher. The archetypes of this era were new and in some cases have never fully returned. The 6'9" point guard who runs the offense and controls the game from the perimeter while also being a legitimate scoring and rebounding threat. Nobody has done what Magic did at that size before or since. Or what about the cold-blooded floor-spacing forward who makes everyone around him better through vision and will rather than athleticism? Burr's version of that was unique to him, and the team built entirely around defensive identity and collective toughness, willing to sacrifice individual glory for the singular purpose of making the opponent miserable. The Bad Boy Pistons left a blueprint that every great defensive team since has studied, even if none have fully replicated it. All of it was about to be eclipsed, because while Detroit was celebrating its second championship in the summer of 1990, a player in Chicago was watching from the outside, having lost to the Pistons 3 years in a row, and deciding that what had been done to him was never going to happen again. Michael Jordan had studied what the Pistons did to him, built himself into something even more dangerous, surrounded himself with enough talent that Detroit's blueprint no longer worked, and then swept the Pistons in 1991. The Bad Boys walked off the court before the final buzzer without shaking their hands. An era was officially over. What happened next was something the sport had never quite seen before. Basketball had always had great scorers, but those were big men and forwards, players operating from the post or the mid-range. The idea of a shooting guard whose entire identity was built around creating his own shot from the perimeter, driving through traffic, pulling up over defenders, manufacturing points from anywhere on the floor with pure individual skill, that archetype basically didn't exist before Michael Jordan. Clyde Drexler in Portland came closest, but unfortunately for him, he spent his entire career being compared to Jordan. Drexler was genuinely great. He was also the second best version of something that Jordan had invented. The NBA in the 1990s was still an extremely physical league. Getting to the basket still meant absorbing real contact. The Knicks under Pat Riley turned physical defense into a religion, and scoring actually started to decline through the mid to late 90s as defensive systems caught up with offensive talent. The game got so physical and so slow that by the end of the decade, after Jordan's second retirement, ratings fell and the sport was in genuine trouble again. The league responded with a 5-second back to the basket rule, forcing post players to stop camping with a ball and grinding possessions into nothing. Zone defense, which had been banned for decades, was eventually reintroduced. The league was clearly searching on how to bring those views back up. The Jordan era had also created a very specific problem. He was so dominant, so singular, that when he left the second time, the game had no obvious successor and nobody quite knew what direction the sport was supposed to go. The game that Magic and Bird had made glamorous and Jordan had made global was starting to look like a grind again. That was until the NBA found its new answer in Los Angeles. Shaquille O'Neal was the sport's reminder that some forces of nature can't be legislated away. Remember that endangered archetype from the first chapter? The dominant big who was too strong and too large for the rules to fully contain? Well, Shaq was its return from extinction. 7'1", over 300 pounds, with a combination of size and power the league had no answer for. Zone defense was reintroduced partly as a response to him, giving teams the ability to collapse multiple defenders without leaving their man. It didn't stop him, it just made him work a little bit harder. But Shaq didn't arrive alone. Kobe Bryant came to Los Angeles as a 17-year-old who had decided he wanted to be Michael Jordan so completely that he had reverse engineered Jordan's entire game from film. The footwork, the mid-post isolations, the turnaround jumpers, the defensive intensity. Kobe didn't just admire Jordan's game, he disassembled it, studied every component, and rebuilt it inside his own body. He became the definitive proof that the shooting guard archetype Jordan had invented could sustain a franchise on its own. 2 more championships came after Shaq left.
Just got one more than Shaq.
An 81-point game.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have witnessed the second greatest scoring performance in NBA history.
An MVP. The blueprint worked with or without a dominant big alongside it. But what made the Shaq and Kobe pairing so important to the evolution of basketball was that it represented 2 completely different models of dominance sharing the same floor. Shaq was the old world, the dominant big, the force of nature who broke defensive by being physically impossible to stop. Kobe was the new world, the isolation scorer who could beat you from anywhere. They won 3 consecutive championships and fought constantly about which model of basketball was actually correct. They ended up both being right, which is what made the partnership so electric and its breakdown so inevitable.
A three-peat and a sweep.
An unbelievable feeling, to win 3 in a row.
Shaq later won a championship again in Miami, still one of the most physically overwhelming players in the league well into his 30s.
Oh, and Shaquille O'Neal.
Proving once more that the dominant big wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. The archetype that Wilt had defined, that everyone assumed the modern game had outgrown, had come back and reminded the league that no amount of rule changes fully neutralizes a man who is simply too large and too strong to be stopped. But even as Shaq and Kobe were winning championships, something else was quietly happening to the league around them. Something that wouldn't fully reveal itself for another decade, but was already beginning to take shape. The game was about to enter its darkest creative period. A stretch so ugly and so unwatchable that the league would eventually be forced to tear down nearly every defensive rule it had built and start over. And out of that darkness, the modern NBA was born. We start with the Detroit Pistons upsetting the Los Angeles Lakers in 2004 as one of the greatest upsets in finals history and one of the most important moments in the evolution of basketball. Detroit had no superstar, no number one option, no player the league had been built around. What they did have was 5 guys who trusted each other completely, a defensive system that was suffocating in its precision, and a collective identity so strong that it rendered the most talented roster in basketball irrelevant. Chauncey Billups ran the offense with ice in his veins. Richard Hamilton ran off screens for 40 minutes a night without ever getting tired. Tayshaun Prince was one of the best team defenders in the league. Ben Wallace was an absolute force without ever needing to score.
Give and take.
They were a masterpiece of team construction and they beat Shaq and Kobe and won a championship doing it. And then the ratings came in and nobody had watched. This is the uncomfortable truth about that Pistons team and about the era that they represented. The basketball was correct. It was disciplined and smart and genuinely beautiful if you understood what you were looking at. But the casual fan didn't want to understand what they were looking at. They wanted highlight reels. They wanted stars. They wanted somebody to root for or against. The 2004 finals was the lowest rated in NBA history at that point, and the league looked at those numbers and made a quick decision. Physical defensive basketball, the grinding half-court game that the Bad Boy Pistons had pioneered and Detroit had revived, was killing the product. Something had to change. So for the 2004-2005 season, hand checking was eliminated completely and permanently. They also removed the forearm bar. No more using your body to physically steer a ball handler wherever you wanted him to go. And that perimeter, that three-point line, it opened overnight.
Look out. Now you can't foul. Here's Richardson. A leaning three. I got it at the buzzer. Jason Richardson has won the game for Golden State.
Guards who had been fighting through contact on every single dribble suddenly had space that they never had before. The game got faster, scoring climbed, and a very specific type of player, one who had existed in a limited form for years but never had fully thrived in the physical environment of the 1990s, suddenly became the most valuable person on the floor. The pass-first point guard had been Stockton's gift to basketball. John Stockton spent over a decade in Utah, proving that a guard who prioritized getting everyone else involved, who measured his greatness in assists rather than points, who made the right play every single time, even when the right play was the boring one, could be the foundation of a championship contender. He never won a ring, but he did change the position. And in the post-hand-checking era, his archetype flourished in a way it never had before. Steve Nash won back-to-back MVPs running the Phoenix Suns offense at a pace that almost felt reckless. He wasn't a scorer. He was a conductor, finding open men before they were open, making the game look easy in a way that disguised how impossibly difficult what he was actually doing was. Jason Kidd rebuilt franchises in New Jersey and Dallas with pure playmaking, averaging close to double-digit assists for years while barely needing to score. Rajon Rondo in Boston was so committed to the pass-first identity that he was a genuine liability at the free throw line, and it almost didn't matter because of what he created for everyone else. But something interesting happened to that archetype just years later. It went extinct. Not slowly either, but completely. The modern NBA decided that a point guard who couldn't create his own shot was a liability. And as you guys know, today every point guard in the league is expected to be a scoring threat first and a playmaker second. The pure pass-first guard, the player Stockton invented and Nash perfected, no longer has a place in the game. Another archetype, gone. But not every team was chasing the new rules. Not every front office looked at the open floor and decided to reinvent itself. One organization had decided a long time ago that none of that ever mattered. The Spurs were the sport's greatest proof that fundamentals never die. From the moment they drafted Tim Duncan in 1997, they built something that completely countered every trend the league was chasing. Just ball movement, discipline, defensive positioning, and a collective basketball intelligence that made them almost impossible to game plan against. Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker brought a style that the NBA had never fully seen. While the rest of the league was reacting to whatever the newest trend was, the Spurs were simply executing. They won 5 championships across 3 different decades. Even they had to adapt to the modern day NBA just a little bit. Look at Tim Duncan, one of the greatest power forwards who ever lived. He quietly shifted to the center spot in the later years of his career. It was a deliberate strategic decision all made by Greg Popovich. The power forward position had evolved into something that required consistent perimeter shooting and floor spacing. He was still quick enough, long enough, and smart enough to anchor the middle in the pace and space era the league was entering. And it worked. That was the clear sign that the game had fundamentally changed. One of the most decorated players of his generation had to change his position in his 30s. And that exact detail tells you everything about how dramatically basketball had changed from the 90s to the 2010s. The center position was in full identity crisis. Dwight Howard was supposed to be the next great one. He had won 3 consecutive Defensive Player of the Year awards and dragged his team to the finals. But when it came to winning as the primary option, his offensive limitations became impossible to hide. And after him, the league essentially stopped believing a traditional center could anchor a championship roster. The center position wasn't just changing, it was disappearing. Until 3 players from 3 different corners of the world decided to rebuild it from scratch into something nobody had ever seen before. Now, while all of this was happening, LeBron James arrived in the NBA in 2003 and immediately raised a question the sport didn't have an answer for. What position is this? He was Magic's size, but faster. He had Magic's vision, but could also score like Jordan. Magic had redefined the point guard. LeBron abolished the concept of positions entirely. He didn't play a position. He played basketball, better than almost everyone else on the floor at any given moment, regardless of where he was standing.
Takes it away. Chalmers. Oh,
He was the living proof that the evolution of the sport was pointing towards something new. Not a dominant big, not a scoring guard, not a pass-first facilitator. Something that had never existed before. The player who could do everything.
Drive. Oh, busting ankles, Kevin Durant.
Kevin Durant arrived a few years later and pushed that idea even further. 7 feet tall with a 7-foot wingspan. But he moved and shot like a guard. He could post up a center, face up a small forward, pull up over a point guard, or drift to the 3-point line and drain shots that had no business going in. The defenders had no reference point for him because he didn't fit in any category that they had been trained to defend. He was too tall to guard with a perimeter player and too skilled to guard with a big. He was a walking mismatch against the entire sport.
Durant working his way in. Basket counts and a foul.
Durant's arrival accelerated something that LeBron had started. The idea that a basketball player needed to be definable, needed to fit into a position, needed to stay in a lane. Well, that was dying. The positionless era had arrived. And as the game was evolving towards smaller, more versatile, and more skilled players, the dominant center position was quietly disappearing. That archetype that had defined the very first era of NBA basketball, the position that Mikan built, that Wilt broke and rebuilt, that Russell used to win 11 championships, that Shaq dragged back from extinction with sheer force of will, was going extinct again. Teams stopped building around centers, stopped drafting them first overall. The dominant big who couldn't shoot, who couldn't put the ball on the floor, who needed to stand near the basket to be effective, that player had finally run out of road. In the midst of positionless basketball and the death of archetypes and a league still searching for what it wanted to be, a 6'3" guard with bad ankles and a frame that looked more like a college sophomore than an NBA star looked at the newly opened floor, looked at the space that hand-checking's elimination had created, looked at that 3-point line that had been sitting mostly ignored since 1979, and decided he was going to do something with it that nobody had ever imagined possible. His name was Steph Curry, and he didn't just change the game, he broke it. Before Curry, there were shooters, great ones. Reggie Miller spent 2 decades in Indiana making opposing fans miserable with that quick release off the catch. And don't forget Ray Allen, perhaps the most mechanically perfect shooter the sport had ever seen. Both of them changed games. Both of them were feared. Both of them just so happened to be catch and shoot players. They needed somebody to create the shot for them. They needed a screen, a curl, a kick-out pass. They were weapons that required someone else to load them. Nobody had ever attempted to stretch a defense so far beyond the arc that the entire concept of defensive positioning became obsolete. Steph Curry was not supposed to be this. He was a guard with chronically bad ankles who fell to the 7th pick in the draft because teams didn't believe that his body could hold up. He had no position in the traditional sense. He wasn't big enough to bully anyone, and he wasn't fast enough to blow past elite defenders in a straight line. What he had was a shooting range that extended so far beyond anything the sport had seen that it effectively didn't exist in the vocabulary of NBA defense. You get a hand up, you contest the shot, You make it difficult. That's a defender's job. But closing out on Curry from 35 feet meant leaving him 35 feet from the basket. And Curry was pulling up from 35 feet like other players pull up from 15. The math of defending him simply did not work. The Golden State Warriors built an entire offensive system around this impossibility. Draymond Green facilitating from the middle. Klay Thompson spacing the floor with a shooting ability nearly as terrifying as Curry's. Ball movement so fluid and so fast that by the time a defense had rotated, the ball was already somewhere else. But here's what made it truly revolutionary. Nobody took them seriously at first. The phrase defense wins championships had been the operating principle of the NBA for decades. The Bad Boys proved it. The 2004 Pistons proved it. The Celtics of the late 2000s proved it. Conventional wisdom said that you build a championship team from the inside out, with size and toughness and defensive identity. The Warriors were doing the opposite. They were a small, offensively minded team that shot threes at a volume nobody had ever attempted and played defense as an afterthought in the eyes of most analysts. They were fun to watch, but they weren't serious. They were not a championship team. Then they won. Then they won again. And then again. And the entire league stopped what it was doing and stared. What happened next was one of the most dramatic tactical shifts in the history of professional sports. Every front office in the NBA looked at what Golden State had built and arrived at the same conclusion simultaneously. We need shooters. We need spacing. We need to play exactly like that. Teams that had spent decades building around dominant bigs and defensive identity started trading for three-point specialists and stretching their lineups. Remember that center position that was already struggling? Well, it took another blow as teams started playing smaller and faster to match the Warriors' spacing. What about the mid-range jumper? The bread and butter shot of the Jordan and Kobe era? Well, that was also declared statistically inefficient and essentially abandoned. You need pull-up threes and shots at the rim. That's what the analytics said, and well, the league listened. By the 2023-24 season, the Boston Celtics, a franchise whose entire identity had been built on defense and toughness since the Bill Russell era, set the record for the most three-point attempts in a single season in NBA history. That's right, you heard that correct. Bill Russell's Celtics. They attempted more threes per game than any team ever. That is how Steph Curry completely rewrote the sport. But here's the thing about evolution. It never stops. And while Curry was dismantling defensive schemes from 30 feet, while Durant was making positions irrelevant, while LeBron was doing everything at once, something was quietly developing in the center position that nobody had anticipated. And no, not the old dominant big that we talked about. Not the physical force who camped in the paint and demanded the ball. Something entirely new. The point center. Nikola Jokic arrived in Denver as a second-round pick, drafted in the middle of a Taco Bell commercial. He was a chubby kid from Serbia who looked like he'd be more comfortable at a poker table than a basketball court. He was slow by NBA standards, couldn't jump particularly high, and had no obvious physical attribute that screamed franchise player. What he did have was a passing vision so advanced that it belonged on a point guard, a feel for the game so sophisticated it bordered on supernatural, and a skill set so complete that defenses had no blueprint for containing him.
Barton, give it to Jokic. Oh, what a pass back to Curry. Score!
He led the league in assists as a center. He's won 3 MVP awards so far. He's won a championship so far. He did it all from the 5 position while playing a style of basketball that looked nothing like anything a center had ever done before. He wasn't posting up and demanding the ball like Shaq. He wasn't protecting the rim like Russell. In fact, far from it. He was orchestrating the entire offense from the high post like a quarterback, threading passes through impossibly small windows, and occasionally pulling up for a 3 just to remind you that he could do that too. Joel Embiid came from a different direction, but arrived at a similar conclusion. A 7-footer who could post up like a traditional big, step out and hit threes, put the ball on the floor and create off the dribble, and anchor a defense on the other end. The complete center. The player who took every skill the position had ever demanded and also added the perimeter game that the modern era required. And then came a kid named Victor Wembanyama, although most people call him an alien. He is 7 feet 4 inches tall, and he does everything. And I mean everything. He blocks shots like Bill Russell, using timing and instinct rather than just size. He scores in the post like the dominant bigs of the early era. He handles the ball and passes like Magic Johnson. He shoots threes like Steph Curry. He reads the game with the intelligence of Larry Bird. He moves with the fluidity of a player a foot shorter. He is, in the most literal sense possible, the sum of everything the sport has learned in 80 years. Every evolution, every rule change, every archetype that rose and fell and rose again, every player who broke the game and forced it to rebuild itself from the ground up. All of it points towards what Wembanyama represents. Not just a great player, another new category of player that we may never see again. And that's what makes the NBA of today so remarkable. Not that it's unrecognizable from what it was in 1946, though it absolutely is, but that every single thing that makes it unrecognizable has a reason. Every three-pointer traces back to the ABA and then to Curry. Every positionless lineup traces back to Magic and then LeBron and then Durant. Every rim protecting, floor spacing, ball handling center traces back to Russell proving defense wins, to Wilt proving size matters, to Shaq proving the dominant big never truly dies, and to Jokic proving the position could be something that nobody had ever imagined. The peach baskets are gone. The set shot is gone. The 6-foot lane is gone. The hand check is gone. The pure pass first point guard is gone. The dominant big who never needed a jumper is gone. The game has shed every version of itself that no longer worked and kept everything that did. And that's not a bad thing. That's evolution doing exactly what it's always done. And somewhere out there right now, there's a 12-year-old in a driveway working on a skill that doesn't have a name yet, developing a move that no coach has ever taught, playing a style of basketball that the current rules weren't built to contain. We don't know who they are. We don't know what they'll do. But if history has taught us anything, the league will have no answer for them either. They'll do what they've always done. They'll change the rules, because in basketball, the game never stops evolving. It just waits for the next person crazy enough to break it. And if 80 years has taught us anything, that person's already out there. They just haven't introduced themselves yet. If you enjoyed, be sure to drop a like, subscribe, hype this video up, and be sure to check out our podcast channel, Jay-Z Courtside. And why don't you check one of the other videos that are popping up on your screen right now? I'm sure you'll love them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.